This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics, reviews of Plox, Bird Boy, and The Mouth.
Countdown for blast off. X-5, 4, 3, 2, X-1, fire.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean.
And we're two guys talking about webcomics. And for our August show, we're going to be looking at 3 webcomics, 2 currently ongoing and 1 already completed. We're going to begin by looking at Steve Hamaker's Plox. After that, we're going to discuss Ann Szabla's Bird Boy, and then we're going to wrap up with a webcomic that is completed, Brendan Albetski's The Mouth. But before we get into a discussion of those, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. August is no different. Sometimes those specials are at 45% off cover price. Sometimes at 50% off cover price. But many times, you can find discounts that are much more impressive than that.
And you can also check out mydigitalcomics.com, which is their sister site. And they have a lot of good specials as well. Right now they're running a promotion where you can earn 5% towards your DCBS purchases for anything that you buy at mydigitalcomics.com. And one of their hot titles that they've gotten picked up lately is Peter Panzerfaust. The big Image comic that's been reviewed very well, I think, by a lot of people. And you can go ahead and get the entire run digitally through that service and have the discount going back to your MCB or your DCBS purchases later.
That's great. In fact, Peter Panzerfaust is one of those titles I've been meaning to pick up. So, if I needed it, I could get it through mydigitalcomics.com. But definitely check them out as well as the main company, Discount Comic Book Service. So whether you go through dcbservice.com or mydigitalcomics.com, you can't go wrong. Go there for all your comics pre-ordering needs, and after you do, please be sure to drop them a line and tell them that we sent you. So, if you guys are longtime listeners of our webcomic series and you started to listen to this episode from the beginning, you're probably wondering, things sound a little different. What is going on? And the reason for that is, as we announced at the very end of our July episode of the webcomic show, Andy Wolverton, who has been my co-host on the webcomic show since the beginning, we started back in December, decided to step down. He's got something else he's wanting to do with the Comics Alternative. We're not going to announce that yet, but it is going to be impressive, and I'm excited about it. But he couldn't do that and co-host the monthly webcomic series at the same time because it's just too much time for him. But what we have, though, is a new co-host who will be working with me from here on in. It is Sean Kleefeld. Sean, welcome to the Comics Alternative Webcomic series.
Thanks very much, Derek. Appreciate that.
And, you were the first person that I thought of when Wolverton said, I want to step down. Do you think that you can find someone different to take my place? Because I knew you before we started to do the webcomic show, and even before Andy said that he wanted to step down, you and I were going back and forth about webcomics, and you were telling me about some of the work you've done, some of the readings and analysis you've done. So, you were the guy to turn to for this.
Well, I'm thrilled that you thought of me that quickly. I appreciate that. It's one of those things. I've been reading webcomics for years and years now, and it's always struck me how little attention that they've gotten in kind of the comics industry press, generally speaking. Mm-hmm. There's some really fantastic stuff being done across the board. And, you get an occasional mention here and there by this person or that person. It might show up on this website or that website, but I've always felt that there's been far too little attention given to the medium as a whole relative to other comics. So I've kind of made it my point to do a lot of studying about it, and anytime I get an opportunity to somebody comes up and says, "Hey, Sean, you want to write for this or that or whatever," I'm right there with, "Hey, that sounds great. Can I do a webcomic piece? Can I do a webcomic column?" It's really, I think there's a lot of brilliant stuff going on out there, and it's just not getting nearly the amount of attention it deserves.
Now, it's interesting that I first got to know you. It's been maybe a little over 2 years now, and it had nothing to do with webcomics. But when we used to do our on-location shows at what once was Lone Star Comics, which is now Collected Comics and Games, the manager of the Plano Lone Star Comics, who would let us, go in and do our on-location shows, he, actually sponsored the our podcast for a while, and what he would do is give us things to give away in contests. So every month we had some kind of contest, and we would use our monthly on-location show to draw names and to see who won whatever gift it was that the manager, Rick, wanted to donate. And you were one of our first winners, and I can't remember what you won. What was it?
It is a Walking Dead stuffed headstone.
Oh, okay.
Which is sitting about 6 feet away from me as we speak.
Actually, I remember that month because was it? I don't know if it was around Halloween or for some reason I remember that for whatever reason that month Rick gave us quite a number of things to give away.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I do remember there were several contests going on that came up like one after another, and I remember entering in all of them pretty much.
Yeah, well, I know for this particular month, though, we had like a number of gifts, and I at least 4, I think 5 or 6 really to give away. And so we would always get a good, healthy number of people who would want to go into the drawing. So we drew on that particular episode several names, like 5 or 6, and those are the guys who won the prizes. And at first I thought, hey, that was pretty cool. But then I found out later, the gifts were free to us. We're going to have to pay. The podcast pays to mail them.
Yeah.
And with all of those gifts, for one, it's no big deal. But for several, well, it added up. And I didn't gripe about it, but I told Rick afterwards, I said, maybe one a month would be good. That'd be enough. So, yeah, you were one of our first winners, and so that's how we got to initially correspond. And then it wasn't until around the time, maybe right before we were doing the webcomic show, that I learned about your passion for webcomics.
Yeah, I've been writing about them in some capacity for 6-7 years now, like regularly on top of whatever other comics writing that I've been doing. And I had a great compliment. I went to, when I attended the opening of the Billy Ireland Museum a few years back, there was tons of comic book people there, and everybody's kind of meeting each other for in a lot of cases, the first time, right? Hey, I talked to you online. I know you by reputation, that kind of thing. And I had another guy come up to me. He was working on his doctoral thesis on incorporating webcomics. And he came up, he's like, Sean, I know you because you're the only guy writing about this right now. I mean, if I do any kind of searching online for information about webcomics, your name is the only one that comes up, period. I mean, it's like, and that really dawned on me at that point, is like, nobody is talking about this. Nobody is talking about this. That's just a shame. I mean, you go back and you pull stuff out and you get Scott McCloud's Reinventing Comics, and that's about it. There's I actually have on my bookshelf here, I have every book written about webcomics. There are 5. 2 of them by the same guy, or same collection of guys, I should say. And it's webcomics have been around for, decades now. We're in, we've got guys who are considered old guard who, have their webcomics of 10, 12, 15 years, your Scott Kurtz's, and that kind of thing. And they weren't the originators, right? They were guys who came in, they were like second gen people, and they're now considered the old guard, because it's, we're talking 2 or 2.5 decades of webcomics now. And it's still getting so little press. Absolutely mind-boggling to me.
But you had a column on MTV Geek, right?
Yeah, I had a webcomics column on MTV Geek until they shut that entire thing down. And right now I've got a webcomics column on freaksugar.com. Which is basically all the guys who worked for MTV Geek got together and said, "Oh, we could do this without the MTV overlords." So, we're carrying on the tradition there.
Yeah. Now, you talked about your writing. Where can our listeners go to see some of your writing in action, so to speak?
Well, the quickest, easiest place is I've got the almost requisite blog at klefeldoncomics.com. And there I have a daily piece on whatever kind of strikes my fancy in regards to comics in general. And I've got a few other things going on. I mentioned freaksugar.com. I write a ongoing webcomics column there, as well as an ongoing column on what I call fanthropology, kind of the study of fans and fandom in general. It's not limited to comics specifically, but, the kind of everybody who might show up at Comic-Con, for example, your sci-fi fans, your comic fans, your cosplayers, steampunk guys, all of that. What motivates somebody to do that, and get as involved as they often do. And that's a column that kind of sprung out of the book I wrote a few years back called Comic Book Fanthropology, where I sat down and then studied who and what these fans are, why they do what they do, which you can buy that on Amazon if you want. Just look up my name. There's not too many books under Kleefeld there. But I am working on another one as well. That's in the works. I don't have a release date yet. It's kind of been going slower than I'd like, but it's looking at the old Blackstone comics from the 1940s. There's a lot of fascinating stuff going on. Blackstone was Harry Blackstone Sr. was a very famous magician back in his day. Not very well known anymore, in part due to his son's presence. His son was, if you mention Blackstone the magician, everybody thinks of the 1970s magician. That was his son, Blackstone Jr. But Blackstone Sr. was actually very popular and had a comic book based off of his adventures. And I kind of stumbled across the fact that every one of those episodes or one of those installments was written by Walter Gibson, who is the creator of The Shadow, and was an amateur magician himself, and apparently was a good friend of Blackstone's. And I just found a lot of fascinating things going on in there. And the more I looked into it, the more serendipitous occurrences I found throughout, just kind of weaving through the whole tapestry of how those comics came about, and that's another one that just no one has ever really talked about. None of those comics have ever been reprinted, and there's almost nothing written about them.
Yeah, I didn't know about them. So the book is on Blackstone?
Yeah, the book will be on actually the kind of the creation of the comics as a whole. So it'll touch on Blackstone himself, Walter Gibson, some of the artists who were involved. My personal favorite is E.C. Stoner. It's a great name, right?
Yeah.
But very, very, not very well known artist from the 30s and 40s. He didn't stay in comics very long, only about just about a decade. and then kind of got out into advertising, eventually fine art. But yeah, it's just kind of touching on all of that, getting into the publishers, because it actually switched publishers, I think, like 4 or 5 times. There were a series done by Street and Smith, another one done by EC Comics, another one done by Timely. It was all across the board. It kind of basically picked up and went from one to the next to the next to the next. It's an absolutely fascinating story, and like I said, no one's ever written about it. So I'm hoping to pull all that together in one piece and hopefully have that sooner rather than later, but we'll see.
Wow. Okay, so something to look forward to.
Yeah.
Well, you can keep us updated on our monthly shows.
I absolutely will.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the introduction of you to our listeners. And speaking of our show, you want to go ahead and get into a discussion of the webcomics for this month?
Absolutely.
Now, we're going to begin with Plox. This is a series created by Steve Hamaker. And, if the name Steve Hamaker sounds familiar, then, well, you're probably a fan of Bone and Razzle, because he did the coloring of those works. He is an Eisner Award winner. And is this his first webcomic that you know of, Sean?
Yeah, it's the first one that I know of, yeah.
Yeah, and he's been going about this, I think, when did it start? It started earlier this year.
Yeah, I think it started early this year. I want to say January, February. So
that's the sense that I got. And, sometimes, as we've discussed on this series, sometimes it's easy to figure out when installments of webcomics go up. And so you have a pretty clear beginning and either end or the last installment date. With this one, though, the individual installments aren't dated, but I got a rough sense looking around that it started around maybe February of 2015, and of course it's currently ongoing.
Yeah.
So if you were going to describe this to the uninitiated, and many of our listeners may be uninitiated, ignorant of Hamaker's Plox, how would you describe this one?
It's a... Let me see here. It's kind of a quiet series in that it's basically about a small group of friends or acquaintances, are probably more accurate, in Columbus, Ohio, where Steve is actually lives and works currently. And they're all gamers, and they have they go online and play the various war games and shoot 'em ups and whatever. And they form these guilds, and they have relationships with one another. But then the interesting thing with this is that there's actually a romantic relationship between two of the characters, but the story picks up shortly after that they break up. So then how do they deal with the relationship status just on a personal level, while also trying to deal with working in the gaming environment that they also enjoy, as well as all their mutual friends that they know through the gaming industry and through the game itself.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned that the story begins right around the time that the two of the three main characters, Chad and Kim, have broken up, and they use, in one form or another, the work that they do together, or the play, I guess you could say, they do together on the game, as an excuse to get angry with one another, or at least Chad angry against Kim, and Kim to do what she does with Chad. And so that's where we are. Now, we come to find out fairly early in the story that there are other reasons why Kim and Chad probably broke up. And so that's presented at the very beginning. And every now and again, this reason, it's that Kim is discovering that she's a lesbian. That comes up every now and again, and it's something that some people she'll tell, some people she doesn't. So, and I mentioned that in that it's part of a larger theme that I see at work here in Plox, and that is the way that you present yourself to others and then the way that you see yourself as you actually are, and how sometimes those identities aren't they definitely don't mesh, and sometimes they are quite radically different. And we see this not only with Kim, but also in terms of Chad, and maybe especially with Chad, because with him, and this is something that the third member, there's basically a triumvirate that this comic is based on. We see other characters, but the three main characters are Chad, Kim, and Roy. And they're three friends. They have a long history. Roy is someone who seems like a gentle soul, and he will tell people like it is, but not in a rude or a rough way. But one of the things he's pointed out to Chad a few times is that in person Chad is a nice guy and people like him, but online he can be a real bastard. When he is playing the game with other people, they have a problem with him, and that's one of the reasons why Kim basically does what she does at the beginning, and that is kicks him out of the guild. And in fact, it's a guild that he created. So, but again, getting back to this larger theme of appearance and reality and how someone's identity is different depending on the context. And I think that works very well throughout the comic, but especially with the characters of Chad and Kim, at least so far.
Yeah, and that's it makes a lot of sense that he's got this framed around the video game aspect, right? Because not everyone, certainly, but a lot of gamers go in and make a deliberate attempt to present themselves differently online than they do in the normal world. Right? There's that sense of escapism, as I can be the hero and I can save the damsel in distress or what have you, which I can't do in my everyday job as a fry cook or whatever it is that they're actually doing day to day, right? So you've got this framework almost inherently built into the structure about that changing identity or that identity shifting that's going on. And I think that it's in Columbus, Ohio. I know Steve has made a point of expressing and trying to express Columbus as a character as well. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. I haven't lived in Ohio. I haven't lived in Columbus. I've spent most of my life in Ohio, though, and there's some interesting dynamics that go on in that, particularly with lesbianism and gay characters, LGBTQ, and in general. In that, it's not overtly sexist. It's not overtly homophobic. But there are notable contingents of that in there. So it makes especially good sense that Kim is kind of a little bit reserved and doesn't tell everybody up front, oh, hey, I'm a lesbian. She tries to play that off, I think, in a lot of cases. And I think that's in part because of where it's located, right? It's, if you had this set in, say, Los Angeles or New York or, a city that's maybe a little bit more, has a larger history of being open with that, I think you'd have a different kind of dynamic going on and a different character in Kim, right? She'd approach this a lot differently, I think.
Exactly. Now, a couple of things that you said there, things that you said reminded me of a couple of things. Well, one, that Hamaker is attempting to make Columbus almost like a character. And you're right. I mean, throughout this story, and this story right now is at 22 chapters. Now, that may sound like a lot, but one of the things about Plox is that the individual chapters are relatively short. And then some are shorter than others. So it doesn't take long to read through the 22 chapters that we're up to at this point. But throughout most of these chapters, many of them begin or at least have embedded somewhere within the chapter a street image. And so you will see, let's say, an establishing shot of a street sign with, the cross streets, at the corner of this street and that street. You will see skylines. You will see streets in the city. In other words, you'll see physical location that really the action would not suffer at all if you removed those scenes. But what you would lose is this sense of place. And so that gets back to what you said a moment ago, that it's as if Columbus becomes a character itself. And especially when you link it to the significance of Kim and maybe tolerance of those that are different. For instance, people in the LGBT community. So there's that. Now, another thing you said was, this is, based around gamers. It's not just any game or video game. It is online video game. So it's very interactive. And so it's not just these guys, Chad, Roy, and Kim, sitting down together to play whatever it is that they're playing in front of, like with their Xbox in front of a big TV screen. I mean, these guys are playing online. And so there's that interactive element. Now, the reason I mention this is because this becomes quite significant when it comes to the character of Roy. Now, Roy is someone at the very beginning, soon after he learns that Kim has basically thrown Chad out of the guild, Roy says, I'm going to quit playing this online game. And not because he's pissed at what Kim did, even though he does want this relationship between Chad and Kim repaired, but he wants to get back to, and he doesn't describe it this way, I don't think, but this is the way I sense it, a more authentic kind of gaming. And in fact, he goes back to some of his old friends that he used to play Dungeons and Dragons with, and he wants to basically pick up their game where they left off. He said, let's get back to getting together, sitting around a table, eating junk food and, wiping our dirty hands on our furniture and our clothes and just, do like we used to, because that's, much more engaging. It's people interacting.
Yeah. And it's maybe worth pointing out too, that, at least I don't know that they're actually identified by age at any point. But Roy is definitely drawn as a slightly older character too.
Right. So
he would have been the type of guy who grew up in, say the 70s playing Dungeons and Dragons, whereas Kim and Chad are younger. Probably that was kind of a fad back in the day. That would have been over and done with by the time they were born, right? So they grew up on Worlds of Warcraft, not Dungeons and Dragons.
Exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned the age thing, because that brings us to, I think, where we are in this story right now. In the most recent chapters, so right now we're at 22, but basically it's chapter 22 and maybe a few before that, there were a few hints as to how Chad and Kim met. In other words, their flashbacks. So right now we have a sense, or at least we're starting to get a sense, of how Chad and Kim got to know one another. We haven't seen really any aspect of their romance at this point, but again, this is something that is currently ongoing, so I'm sure that we're going to get that before long. We have not gotten any information so far about Roy, his backstory, and how he ended up becoming friends with Chad and Kim. So we've seen, this is shown 2 or 3 times, a photograph with the 3 of them together, and they're kind of, hugging one another. And you can tell this is a number of years ago because each of them looks significantly younger than they are right now during the current story time. But that's all we know about that relationship. But we don't know yet how Roy met up with these other guys, and we haven't even seen that much about the nascent relationship between Chad and Kim.
Which is, and here's one of the things I like about Plox, just as in general, is that Hamaker is doing I think a fantastic job in the storytelling there, right? He's got this, you can tell he's got all those pieces in place in his head. He knows the backstory behind all of this, but he's only showing just what the reader actually needs to see, right? We don't know how we don't know Roy's history with regard to anybody here. We don't know the full romance between Kim and Chad. I don't know that we will see how that blossomed, but I don't know that we need to either. Right? At least the way the story's been progressing so far. We do see, here's how Chad and Kim met. Here's how kind of you can see the budding romance. I don't know that we'll actually see maybe the full romance played out, but I don't know that we need to. And I think that speaks well of Hamaker's storytelling ability. He's got that figured out, but he knows he doesn't need to show every piece of it.
Yeah, or at least yet, and I agree with you that at least at this point, there's some information that we don't need yet, but I have a sense that we are going to get more information about Kim and Chad's relationship. We're going to see little bits of it. I would think we'd have to see more information about Roy and how he got to meet these guys because, the aforementioned photograph, I think that was enough of a tease, and it's repeated 2 or 3 times so far. And I think probably for a reason that is something that functions as kind of a visual foreshadowing, that something, we're going to see these guys and how they got together and, the kind of friendship that they formed. But even though we're in 22 chapters, again, it may sound like a lot, but this hasn't been around for that long. I think we're at the very, very early stages of Plox.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure he's got this planned out for quite a while. I haven't seen anything that suggests, okay, he's got a 5-year plan or whatever, but I can easily see this going for 5-6 years without any difficulty.
Yeah. And, if you listeners want to help him in continuing this, we should mention that not only does Hamaker have a Patreon campaign, but he also just recently, what was it, last week or maybe the week before, started a Kickstarter campaign. And in fact, the Kickstarter campaign is based around putting out the first print volume of Plox. And, there are a lot of webcomic creators who do this. There's some who do choose not to go the print route. But, at least half, if not most of the ones that we've discussed on this podcast, they've chosen at some point, whether it's backed by Kickstarter or some other means, to come out with a hard copy of the webcomic in volumes as things evolve. So right now I'm looking at the Kickstarter campaign, and he has 118 backers, and he's at just under $7,000 of, well, he's almost at halfway because his goal is 14,000, and he's almost at 7,000. So wow! And
I think as of this recording, I think he's barely at a week that Kickstarter's been running too. So I think he's doing pretty well. I suspect he'll hit that, would be my guess.
That's impressive. Yeah. And also that tells us if this has only been going on for about a week or a week and a half, then he must have some kind of dedicated following. And that brings me to another aspect of this webcomic that I wanted to point out. Unlike many webcomics, a number of them that we've discussed on this series in months past, this webcomic, Plox, does not have a space for readers to comment. In other words, there's no place for them to get into a discussion, to send notes to Hamaker, to say, wow, I like this, or, I love the way that you drew such and such in this installment, or watch out, something's going to happen, I just know, any number of things. And many times that kind of comment section with a webcomic is one way of getting a sense of how engaged and even how many readers a webcomic creator has. But you can't tell that from the website, but yet when you go to the Kickstarter campaign, it being less than 2 weeks since he started it, and he's already almost at halfway through his goal, that's impressive.
Well, I think it's it makes it more challenging, I think, when you don't have that kind of chat forum directly on the webcomic itself, right? Because obviously, somebody's reading the webcomic, they're on the page, they can just leave their comment instantly, and that's real quick and easy to do. But to Steve's credit, he does seem pretty active on Twitter, and he does have a Plox Facebook page, which is updated pretty regularly, not just with, hey, here's the latest update of the comic, but he also, engages with the fans through that. So I think he's got a good connection with the community, in the comics community in general, and I think that's probably in part because he's got that professional background, right? Is maybe not as the big name of a Jeff Smith or something, but he's a known, and he's worked with Jeff Smith. He's got that known entity. He works and is familiar in comic circles, particularly the ones that are kind of centered out of Columbus, which is surprisingly to me growing hotbed of comics activity, just generally speaking.
Yes. Now, this is something that Andy Wolverton and I would bring up every now and again on the webcomic shows, and that is how successful or maybe unsuccessful or even irritating the comment section under some webcomics sites are. What are your thoughts on commentary sections with webcomics embedded in the daily installments or weekly installments, however frequently they go up?
Well, like I said, I think it certainly makes it easier for the creator to engage with his or her audience. If the person is there on the page reading that day's or that week's installment, they can real quickly and easily get to that comment and say, hey, this was a great thing. I loved how you draw this. That was a great joke, whatever. If you force them off onto Twitter or Facebook or some other venue, that's an additional step. Maybe not everybody's going to act that quickly. I think it makes it more challenging. The flip side to that, like you're kind of alluding to, is that, you can get people come in and start trolling around and saying, oh, this stinks and this is lousy and you suck and, this, that, and the other, and can get into flame wars with the various people who, just get into fights because that's what they do online. There's a reason why they tell you never to read the comment section, right? But I think for the most part, I think they tend to be more beneficial than not. I think it depends a lot on the context and the comment of the webcomic itself and kind of the demeanor of the creator. I think some of the creators, just by their nature, tend to be a little bit more antagonistic, tend to be a little more abrasive, and that tends to encourage and generate more abrasiveness, more acerbicness on the comment section itself. So I think, you get something like, I'm trying to think of a good counter example. I don't have a good counter example off the top of my head. But there's some guys, least I could do. That's a good example. That can be, a very caustic comic at times, not always.
Least I, because I'm not familiar with that one. Least I can do.
Least I can do.
Who's the creator of that one?
And I am drawing on absolute blank on his name at the moment, of course.
Yeah, that happens all the time to me.
Yeah, honestly, I follow so many webcomics these days, I can't even keep track of who's doing them. I can picture him in his head. Lard D'Souza does the art on that, but he's not the writer. Drawing a blank on the writer's name.
Well, this is interesting in that in answering my question, you kind of gone in a direction I didn't even think about, and that is when things can become abrasive. Maybe not so much from the creator's perspective or from coming from the creator or creators, but from the fans. You mentioned trolls. I mean, that could cause problem. I mean, I was thinking more of the opposite. Usually the people that I've seen who take the time to comment are going to be fans, and sometimes these fans can be rather fawning. So their comments, many times I don't necessarily think of them as useful. They go, oh my God, that's awesome. Now, I'm sure that helps to stroke the ego of the creator, which is good, and that's fine. But for a reader, do I really need that there? And another thing that Wolverton and I would point out, that there were some occasions where the creator, him or herself, would get involved in the discussion back and forth and would perhaps inadvertently give away a spoiler. And that's something that you don't want to do. I feel mixed about those comment sections. I think, first and foremost, are they visually intrusive? In other words, is the webcomic laid out in such a way that if I didn't want to look at the comments, I wouldn't have to, and I don't have to basically step over those comments, so to speak, in order to get the real reason why I'm there at the website, and that is to read the various installments of the webcomic. But then also, if I do choose to read the content, is the content going to provide anything other than, oh, that's cool? And if it gives me something that I really don't want, such as spoilers, that's not good at all. Now, I was, after we several months ago discussed Brian Freese's The Last Mechanical Monster, I was going back and forth with him over email, and I had pointed out that there was an issue with the way that some of the click-throughs were, and I didn't post this on the site, but he used that information to actually fix that relatively minor issue. I don't even know if I'd call it a problem. But he also pointed out that there were cases where, with him, one of the commentators would point out that in one illustration, something didn't seem to fit with something that came before, and so he went back through and fixed it. Now, see, that, I think, is useful information, telling someone fix the illustration, or it's hard to see, or maybe the click-through doesn't work correctly. And so that's the benefit, for me at least, of the comment section. But when the comment section is nothing but, oh, that's cool, great, I applaud you, and things of that sort, yeah, okay, nothing wrong with that, but I usually don't take the time to read them.
Yeah, honestly, I don't either. But yeah, from a creator's point of view, I think they're beneficial. Like to your point, a lot of the ones I've seen, the corrections I've seen tend to be, there's typos in the text somewhere, which is, even if you set aside issues of continuity, like, oh, he only had 3 buttons on his shirt in this previous installment or whatever, But the typo thing that can directly impact how legible that particular installment is, right? Because if you guys, it might even change the word or change the meaning, that kind of thing. And that does, I have seen that done before, and I think that's very, very useful. But it depends on, like I said, I think it depends on the tenor of the creator and the comic that they're building, and I think that if you kind of come to the table with a little bit more harsher attitude in the first place, then you're going to get commentators that respond in kind. Whereas if you come to the table with, oh my God, this is so hard, I don't know if I can do this, or hey, you guys are awesome, I love you guys, or you're fantastic fans, or whatever, I think you're going to get a response that reflects that. I think that's one of the benefits of the webcomic over, kind of the traditional comic book model, the traditional comic strip model, where it's basically, the creator sitting in their isolation essentially for 12 months out of the year, 11 months out of the year, and then, oh, hey, here's somebody's pointed out this one error back in some 6 months ago. Well, 6 months ago, I'm not going to fix that, but I think there's an immediacy there. There's a connectedness there, and I think that's something that works very well for webcomics. Is because you've got that immediacy of access, then there's a lot of webcomics that I think do very well. Not because they're necessarily particularly good webcomics; they might be okay, but I think because that the readers can identify and essentially develop a relationship with the creator themselves.
Right.
So you're not following the comic, you're following the creator.
Exactly. And so I think that's one of the benefits of not all, but many webcomics, in that it is community building. Now, there's some creators who choose not to have any of that, or if they do it, as you've mentioned, they may do it off-site, as Hamaker may do, and that's fine. But I think with some of them that we've discussed on this series, there's quite a bit of a community. But to me, the main thing with the comment section is it intrusive in any way? And, of course, getting back to Plox, this does not have one, so it's kind of a moot point.
Right.
Now, in terms of the navigability, because that's something I always like to look at when we discuss a webcomic, I think it's fairly easy to navigate. Each installment, for the most part, is almost a square. So if you're looking at this on a browser or on a portable device like a tablet or maybe even your iPhone or what have you, or your Android, it's not like you have to do much, if any, scrolling to get down to the bottom of the panel once you click on to the next installment. Now, this is where, I mentioned Freeze is the last mechanical monster, and one of the things I pointed out to him in terms of click-throughs is when you clicked or tapped, if it's like a tablet, on the image itself, many webcomics take you to the next page. Many creators do that. Freeze's didn't, and I pointed that out to him, and he said, that's right. It should actually, it'd be a good idea if it did. You tap on one image, and it takes you to the next panel or the next series of panels, the next page. And so he fixed that. And that's the way Plox is. If I'm on, I just picked one installment, and if I click on this installment, what it does is it takes me to the image itself, isolated, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. If I wanted to move forward or backward, there's smaller arrows at the top, toward the top of the page that lets me go back and forth. But if I'm reading this on a tablet, let's say, or if I'm reading this on a smartphone, where the back and forth arrows are going to be a little smaller, I've got really big fingers, or at least I think I have kind of chunky fingers. So it may be difficult for me to press forward. I may accidentally hit backwards by accident. So the ease of just tapping with my finger or even with a mouse onto the image, one page, let's say, that will take me to the next page, would make it a little easier.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. I would also add, too, I'm never a fan of putting this is almost counterintuitive to web design in general. I'm never a fan of putting the navigation items, whether they're arrows or next buttons or whatever you end up using. Never a fan of putting those at the top, because if you have to do any scrolling at all on the page, you've lost your navigation off the page, right? So, you're sitting there reading the comic. It reads top to bottom. You get to the bottom of the page, and then you want to go on to the next one. That's where that arrow should be.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And there's some web comics that have the navigation at the top and at the bottom of the page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that makes the most sense. I mean, it seems a little redundant, but if you're just clicking through, just kind of casually to kind of get a sense of things, it makes sense to have it at the top. You can kind of go through and not move your mouse and go through one to the next real quickly. But like I said, if you're reading through, particularly on any of the comics that are clearly designed for a print format later, with more of a vertical format, you might end up doing some scrolling, and if you do, you're going to lose your navigation. So you have to scroll all the way down to read it, and then scroll all the way back up to get to the next page. So particularly if the image itself is not a link to the next installment.
Exactly. But other issues in terms of navigation of the site, and they're pretty straightforward. At the very top, there's an about. There's a link for the blog, because he also keeps a blog on this site. You can subscribe to this blog. There's a place for that. There's also a place at the top where you can find out where his Patreon and Kickstarter campaigns are. So it's not too elaborate. It's not like you're going to get lost in this. But before we move on from Plox, there's something that we haven't discussed yet, and I wanted to mention this because I think this is one of the story's most interesting selling points, if you will, and that is that with at least one character, and this is Chad, we haven't seen it yet with Roy and Kim, but with Chad, every now and again we get a glimpse inside of his, I don't know if you want to call it his fantasy life or at least his unconscious life, usually when he's asleep, in that he has these strange dreams or fantasies, and that's where some of these flashbacks are embedded. Now, one of the earliest fantasy scenes, I guess he's asleep, and he meets his own character, I guess, his own avatar that I'm assuming is in the game that he had just been kicked out of that guild with. And I think that if this is the direction that Hamaker is going to continue to go, then I find this really exciting, because as you pointed out at the very beginning, one of the big strengths of Plox is the relationship, is the drama among these three characters, and I think that's great. But looking into Chad's unconscious or fantasy life and how you have different worlds come together, which nicely parallels what I was talking about earlier in terms of identity, right? You have different ways of representing yourself depending on who you're talking to, in what context. So, there's some discrepancy there between Chad and what he's dreaming or fantasizing about. I really like that, and I hope to see more of that in the installments to come.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The idea of identity, I think, runs pretty heavily through this, and the idea of with these sequences, the idea that you're essentially confronting your multiple identities, right? You're confronting that very directly, very visually. You don't see that very often. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and on that topic, I think it would have been really easy for Plox to be what similar web comics or just comics in general, on the web or in print, that deal with fans and fandom as a subject matter. I think it would have been easy for Hamaker to fall into a rut of what most creators may do if they look at fandom, and that is just talk about the fun and the quirkiness of fandom. I mean, there is a bit of that in Plox, but to me, I see this as, or Steve Hamaker, within the realm of comics about fandom. Hamaker seems to be more like a Woody Allen within the creators who focus on fandom, and I'll tell you what I mean by that, because the emphasis is on character interaction. It's on relationships. And there are philosophical issues, as we've been discussing, that really undergird this story. And there's sometimes these larger, deeper issues come to the fore. Many times they're just in the background, and it would be easy to miss them. But I think that this is a very sophisticated story that this is one of those that I'm definitely going to keep up with and see how it continues to unfold.
Yeah, and you know what? I actually meant to make this point earlier. Is he's got a very good sense, I think, of who gamers are, right? Just as a collective unit, right? I think there's a lot of people out there. You get the kind of stereotypical teenager in his mom's basement kind of thing,
right?
Or loner character who's just binge plays World of Warcraft, with drinking Dorita or drinking soda and chowing on Doritos and Taco Bell or whatever. But I think Hamaker has a very good sense of who gamers actually are. He's not relying on any sort of stereotypes of the gamer genre. At least in terms of the characterization, certainly. And I think that speaks very well to him. I don't know how involved he is in actual gaming, but it seems like he's done his research there.
Right. Or he's able to empathize.
If he does, he's empathizing very well.
Right. So, Sean, you want to move on to the next title that we're discussing for this episode?
Yeah.
And Szabla's Bird Boy. And by the way, you spell her name Szabla, and on her FAQ page on the website, she even tells you how to pronounce her name. So it's Szabla. Oh, by the way, we didn't even mention the Plox website. It's really easy. It's Plox-comic.com. Now, Bird Boy also has a dash in it. It is bird-boy.com. So put that in your browser and check out what we're about to talk about. And Szabla's Bird Boy. So, Sean, what is Bird Boy about?
Bird Boy is really like a kind of a coming-of-age story. It's a character called Bali. He lives in this kind of small tribal village. And he's about 10 years old and just trying to learn about who he is and kind of find his place in his world. And then the problem he's running into is that because of his small stature. He's not a big guy. He's kind of looked down upon. Like I said, this is kind of a tribal village. So there's still a lot of emphasis on physical prowess, and he does not have very much of it. He's shown very early on to be small and clumsy and not very coordinated. And so he's trying to fight against this idea that others are saying, hey, you're not a man yet. You can't go through the ritual ceremony of our people to become a man and be recognized as a man, because you're this little puny pipsqueak. And so the story of Bird Boy is following this character Bali as he's trying to prove himself, essentially, and grow up and learn to be a man, and what that really means.
Right. Now, in the opening pages of Bird Boy, and right now we should mention that there's one completed volume. We're about in the middle, maybe a little more than halfway through the second volume. The first volume is called The Sword of Mali Mani, and that's an important character we'll get into in a moment, I'm sure. And then the second volume is called The Liminal Wood. So we're about a little more than halfway through the Liminal Wood. But when in the opening pages of this first volume, The Sword of Mali Mani, we do see Bali with a band of hunters of the tribe. The Nuru tribe is what they're called. And the leader of the hunters, Lakasi, I guess you can pronounce his name. That's how I pronounce it.
That's what I'm going with.
Yeah, okay, let's go with that. And he won't let Bali really take part in any reindeer game, right? So, as you mentioned, because he's too small, he's too young, he doesn't know what he's doing, and of course Bali's trying to prove himself. And then we find out fairly early on that there's another character. He's like a shaman character, it seems, from what I gather. Someone named Inani. Who is telling the hunter, the leader of the hunter, Lakasi, you ought to let Bali go hunting. You ought to train him, let him go on something that's called smoke walk, which I guess is some kind of, important hunting mission. And I guess that would be Bali's initiation into manhood. But Lakasi doesn't feel that he's ready. So we do see Bali in the opening pages kind of fumbling around in an almost comedic way. I mean, he's trying to do his best, but whatever he does, it ends up causing problems with the hunters, as Lakasi points out.
Yeah, and it's one of those stories that it's really hits home that this kid is out of his element. This is very much a fish out of water type of character. He's like we said, he's on this hunting mission with the elders of the tribe, or the protectors of the tribe. And not only does he scare away all the deer, but he frightens a giant bear down into them, and they end up having to kind of ward off this giant beast that they were certainly not prepared for. And so he's, seen as this kind of a goofball character almost, in this society that's clearly built up around, kind of a hunter-gatherer society. And there's a very distinct and, hierarchy in pecking order, and it's a very traditional one. Is that necessarily appropriate? We're kind of looking at, this, again, we don't get many details on what this smoke walk is, but it's clearly some kind of coming of age ceremony of some sort, and that he's not even allowed to participate in it, much less attempt it and fail. I think is going to speak a lot about what the story structure is heading towards, and where we're trying to get to as an overall theme for the piece.
Right. Now, when this webcomic first begins, at the very beginning of Volume 1, we get a little context here. And, earlier I mentioned this character, Mali Mani. We learned that Mali Mani, and it starts off, I guess it sounds like a myth, right? It's a creation myth, it seems, that there was someone called Mali Mani, and he took back the light that was taken and then hidden by a creature called the halfway beast. And the Halfway Beast was in cahoots in some ways with this group of creatures called the Rookmen, and the Rookmen become very important, especially toward the end of Volume 1, and they're this ominous presence. I mean, even the name Rookmen does sound a little scary, spooky, and gothic, and that's the way that they're represented, as these kind of dark, secretive, hooded figures that Bali at one point comes up at a couple of points of the comic comes up against. So anyway, so Mali Mani wins back the light for his people, but then he disappears, and so he becomes this myth, this legend. And we come to find out that into Volume 2, people begin to think that maybe Bali may be Mali Mani, which is this nice juxtaposition. You've pointed out a few times that Bali is someone who is small, he's inept, he's kind of a clown figure in many ways, and now here, later on, as we get into the story, he is compared to, and perhaps even mistaken by some, as this great legendary figure that no one has seen in eons, Mali Mani.
Yeah, and I think there's some interesting parallels here, particularly with the fact that Mali Mani, in taking back that light and in that original creation myth, he had this great sword, right? And part of the misrepresentation or potential misrepresentation of Bali, I guess, is because he finds this sword later, right? He stumbles across it and picks it up and is like, oh, hey, this is cool. This will show everybody in the village how great and powerful I am, that I have this great sword. And there's a lot of parallels there with, the old King Arthur myth, right? I mean, it's very directly, he's got the sword that, he's got he's not handed the sword, not pulling it out of stone, is not given it by a water nymph or anything like that. But I mean, that's the exact same iconography, right? Is he's got this weapon of power that's respected among the community, even though he's still this small character that's maybe not entirely deserving of it yet, and he has to learn to grow into that role. Right,
and in fact, his heroism is inadvertent. I know that earlier I made reference to Woody Allen. Well, this will be my second Woody Allen reference to this show. In fact, Andy Kunka always accuses me of trying to make too many references to Woody Allen in every episode, or maybe every other episode of the podcast. But in one of my favorite movies of his, the earlier ones, Love and Death, the main character, Boris, becomes a very similar kind of inadvertent hero. He's someone who doesn't want to, he doesn't like where he is in life. He doesn't like the way that he's seen, and he definitely doesn't want to go to war. I guess a little unlike Bali here, but he becomes a hero because of something he stumbled into. And so he makes a comment at one point about his inadvertent heroism. So yeah, Bali is very much an inadvertent hero in where we are in this story. This does seem, whether it is or not, it does seem like a longer narrative. It's definitely been going on for longer than Plox. But really, there's not much that has happened so far, even though we're about a volume and halfway through the story. And I don't know how many volumes this is going to be. But this webcomic began in October of 2010. And I checked this morning, and the most recent installment was from several days ago, July 30th of this year. Now, if you look on the About page, you will see that Szabla says that this will go up every Thursday, come rain or come shine. Well, obviously, that hasn't been the case because it's been going on for not quite 5 years now, and we do not have enough installments that would justify every single Thursday something going up. And, I'm not holding that against her because these things happen. But I would suggest that she change her About page.
Well, that's I can cut her some slack there because I know that's one of those things you put up an About page and then you end up forgetting about it, that it even exists, right? Because they're focused on the comic. And frankly, I would... speaking me personally, I would rather them focus on that than the strict accuracy of Okay, they missed that one Thursday because it was Thanksgiving, or something like that. I can forgive little bits like that. She's clearly not, she's still clearly putting a lot of work into it. There's still fairly regular updates. That's a minor point for me.
Yeah, well, semi-regular. I won't say fairly regular, because if you look back to see where some of these gaps have been, sometimes they're long stretches. Now, when it comes to the consistency with little things or relatively minor things like, let's say, the FAQ or their about page or what have you. I mean, I'm of two minds here. I'm with you ultimately when it comes to focusing on the content. I would much rather someone be less frequent or less regular and do really good work than feel that they have to put up something every week or every other week or maybe twice a week just because they set out to that and they said they were going to do it, even though each installment may not be really up to snuff. So I'd much rather they take their time. But on the other hand, in the case of Bird Boy, I mean, this is not the only part of her website that needs a little updating. So, for instance, if you go to the website and there is a menu toward the top, and you want to find out who the cast is, hey, I'm clicking. Nothing's going on. Let me go to another page. And, maybe something's set up if I go to the archive and I click on cast. Nope, there's nothing there. Maybe a little updating of some of the simple, basic website layout would be beneficial. But ultimately, when it comes to the content, I mean, that's where this story really shines. And I'd much rather her take her time to do the kind of work that she's doing, because, we didn't say much about Hamaker's art, which I think is really good. I mean, there's some panels that seem almost, like, let's say, the setting of Columbus, almost photographic or close to it. And then other parts of it, for instance, the various characters who are a little more iconic or maybe cartoony, but not in a bad way, the way that they're drawn. I have to say, though, that Szabla's art is the most stylized and the most intricate of the three webcomics that we're looking at this week or this month.
It's, particularly what really drew me was those opening panels when she's doing that creation myth stuff, too. Because she's very much got kind of that stone carving from, ancient Mexico or something going on. It's very, very highly stylized there. That she doesn't carry that through the entire comic, which I think makes sense given, she's trying to separate the two types of stories going on, really. But I found that personally very fascinating, just taking full advantage of a different style of art to say, okay, this is a different type of or a different part of the story that's kind of separated from what's going on with Bali directly. This is a little bit separate from it. It's still relevant, but doesn't affect him directly,
Yeah, but even the art in the story proper, I think is just highly detailed, and you can tell a lot of work goes into it. And that's one of the things that impressed me the most. And along with the art, the pacing of this story that is in many ways embedded in the art itself. I said earlier that even though this has been going on for not quite 5 years, there's really not much that has gone on, and I think one of the reasons for that is that Szabla is giving her narrative a lot of room to breathe. So we could get not just one page or installment, but 2, 3, and more that all focus on or draw out, elongate what other creators could probably or would probably take care of in 2 or 3 panels tops. In other words, they would try to condense the action, but what Szabla does is she decompresses things. Sometimes decompressing can be annoying, but not in her hands. In fact, that's one of the visually beautiful aspects of this comic, is when you see Bali or other characters or creatures doing something that takes a page or 2 in order for it to be fulfilled. And I love those moments.
And what I love about that, too, is she's not only taking the time to have those extended moments and decompress things, but she's showing it to you visually. There's several sequences there where you could go 5, 6, 7 pages without a word of dialogue.
Exactly.
And it makes sense for the story, as Bali's working through the woods himself, and there's no one around to talk to in the first place. But she's okay with just showing, here's what's going on, and I don't need to reiterate that with, either thought balloons or captions or anything like that. It's very kind of spare in terms of the actual verbiage that's being used. But that's not a detriment by any means. It allows you to look at more of her art because it's not cluttered with the word balloons. But it showcases her ability to tell a story visually. And I think she does a fantastic job of showing that. She's not saying, oh, and then he trips over the log. She shows him getting, tripping over the log. And that's probably a bad example. It's kind of easy to show that, but there are a lot of sequences. Like I said, you can go for several pages without a lick of dialogue anywhere in that.
Exactly.
And you don't mind that. I think it works very well. It's a fairly quiet comic in that sense for the most part.
And the action does, for the most part, really does speak for itself. You don't need any kind of text in any way, whether it be something like a voiceover or any kind of dialogue between or among characters to kind of fill you in on what action's going on. Although I will say that, and again, this comes back to her art, which is highly detailed. There are a lot of lines and a lot of detail in the various panels, but there are times where I had to go back and look closely 2 or 3 times to a particular panel or sequence in order to figure out what was going on. Because, one, you don't have the text to help support or to supplement the action. So, you have to let the action speak for itself. But letting the action speak for itself on a couple of occasions was not as easy as it was in most other cases. Again, just because the art is highly detailed. And so trying to figure out contours or actions weren't as easy in some places. But I mean, that's no problem with me. It forced me to do what I should do anyhow, and that is to go back and linger a little longer.
The one thing I would kind of to play off that a little bit is one of the problems I have, and this is kind of a minor problem, and then you and I have kind of talked about this offline in regard to other strips, is that because she does that decompressed storytelling, and one sequence can take a lot longer than another artist might take. The fact that she's only updating one page at a time means that sometimes you lose track of the overall arc of that part of the story, and getting lost in the details, right? So, there'll be a sequence where, Bali's running through the woods. That might take 3 or 4 pages or 5 pages or something. And by the time you got to the 5th page, which is now a month from when he started running through the woods, you've kind of forgotten why he's running through the woods in the first place.
That's
right?
a good point, yeah.
So I think that would work. I think this would work very, very well in a printed format, right? When you've got the whole book down in front of you and you can just flip through it. Or, even as if it's completed, once it's completed online, as you read through the whole thing, I think it'll flow very smoothly. But in terms of following it on a week-to-week basis, that has proven a little challenging at times. Just trying to remember where you left off last week and where that was left off the week before.
Yeah, and I think I remember now the occasion that you mentioned when we were speaking offline, and we did discuss this. And Noelle Stevenson's Nimona, we reviewed that book, the actual print book, several months ago on the regular Comics Alternative show. And one of my comments on the show and even to you was that, as a printed text that is basically exactly what she published as a webcomic, it just didn't work as well for me because of the pacing, and there should have been quite a bit more editing going from the web to the printed version. But then that may have disrupted the narrative or the art, and so she didn't want to do that. Or her publisher didn't want to do that. But that was a case where the translation from web to print didn't work as well. I agree with you, though, when it comes to Szabla, in that if this were in print form, I don't think you would have the same problems as I thought that Nimona had. It may take several pages to get through a particular action, but I don't think that Szabla loses her focus Maybe we as readers do because of the infrequent installments, may have to go back and refresh ourselves. But yeah, this is one I think that if it were, or maybe when it is printed, then it would read really smoothly.
Yeah, and that's surprised me is that she does not have that available as a print book in any capacity at this point.
Not the first volume,
she does,
yeah.
Yeah, she's got, 5 years, essentially 5 years of material there, 2 volumes, and like you said earlier, we're well into volume 2, and there hasn't been a print volume yet, of volume 1. I don't know if that's necessarily deliberate on her part or if that's an intention. I think she would do very well because not only would you get the reading experience of being able to go through the entire book in one sitting, but to your point earlier about having this gorgeous art to look at, I think it would absolutely look brilliant on the printed page. I think we're probably missing a lot of detail that she's including just because of the presentation on the web, right? We're getting a lower res version than you would see in print.
Oh yeah, I mean this is something I think that would look beautiful in print. I mean it looks beautiful on the web, but even richer I think once it's printed. Now she does have a Patreon campaign, so she is, and right now she has 79 patrons, so she is taking funds to support the webcomic itself. But there's nothing there linked to any hard copy form. So in any book, like let's say the first volume, and I'm wondering. I mean, I would assume that something like this she would want to bring to print, but maybe that's not part of her game plan.
Yeah, and that's there's any sort of reasons, right, why anybody can do a webcomic, and it's maybe a little presumptuous of me to assume that her goal is to make money off this and have it as a printed book that she could sell at conventions or whatever. But at the same time, it's formatted already for a print format, right? Exactly. It's got that kind of trade paperback format set up, which kind of suggests that that's what she's going to be doing with it sooner or later anyway. I don't know if maybe she's looking to do maybe just one printed volume for the entire series once it's complete. That's 500 pages or something. I don't know, but
yeah. Well, one of the reasons why I immediately thought that this could or even should be a print comic eventually is that it does remind me of one of my favorite webcomics, and that is Evan Dom's Vatu. I mean, it reminds me of Vatu in a number of ways. One, I think the high detail of the art. I just love what both Szabla and Dom do with their stories, and also both of them are fantasies. And they deal with something similar, this kind of coming of age, So with Vatu, it's the title character who is playing the role in many ways that Bali is playing in Bird Boy. So there's quite a number of similarities going on here.
Yeah, and on top of that, both Vatu and Bird Boy, Bali, are these kind of small diminutive heroes, right? That you wouldn't historically look at as the hero character, right? They're not built up, they're not muscular, they're not heroic looking as we traditionally think of that, and they're kind of playing against type in the visuals on that, which is another great similarity.
Right. Now, before we move on to the last comic, I do want to say something about a character that we're getting relatively late in the story. And in fact, the past several installments deal with this character, but we still don't know much about him. This is someone named Sideways Wolf, or he goes by Sid for short. And in the second volume, when Bali is running away from the Rookmen, he's being chased also by creatures in the woods. In which he's lost. Then he comes across Sid, or Sideways Wolf, and Sid is looking for someone or some things. We don't know. He's calling out a couple of names, and we haven't learned yet what those names refer to. But he takes Bali to a safe place. He runs away with him to his hideaway, and we don't know much about Sideways Wolf. So that's an interesting place to stop, and I know there's going to be more, I would hope, pretty soon. But I want to know more about who this Sid figure is.
Oh, I don't doubt that at all. I'm one of the things that one of the thoughts I had in seeing him, and once they kind of got back from the immediate danger, was he's going to be. I think he's going to turn into the mentor character.
Yes.
For Bali.
I agree.
He's going to be the Obi-Wan Kenobi that says, okay, here's what you need to do. Here's the mission you need to go on. Here's what you do with the sword. And I think we're going to see basically, we're not to demean the idea here, but this is basically going to go the hero route, right? We're going to be looking at the monomyth here, and I think that's the Sid character's role as the mentor.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned Obi-Wan. I just hope to God that Sid does not turn into a Jar Jar Binks.
No, actually, I think the bigger danger we have is Bali being Luke Skywalker, and not the heroic Luke Skywalker, but the whiny early character Luke Skywalker from the start of the first movie. There was actually I was kind of rereading a lot of this, and there's even a line that Bali has early on about what was it? It was almost lifted from Star Wars. Oh, cripes, what was that?
I don't know.
Okay, edit that part out. Forget I said anything about it. I can't think of the line now. But it was an early one of the kind of a why can't I go to Tashi Station to pick up some power converters type of line.
Oh, I know. Generally, I know what you're talking about because
but
it was very whiny at the first.
Yeah, but it had a little bit of that to it. It almost lifted from Star Wars, from what I remember.
Yeah. So, I really like Szabla's Bird Boy. That's another one that I would like to keep up with. Now, one that we probably won't be keeping up with is the last title that we're discussing, and that's because it's already completed, and that is Brendan Albetski's The Mouth. And this is a story that he has on his larger website called Hell to Breakfast. And from what I've seen at Hell to Breakfast, if you go to the website, and this is helltobreakfast.net, and that's one word, Hell to Breakfast, there's one place where you can click on comics, and right now there are only 2 comics up. There is The Mouth, which is already completed, and then there seem to be, I guess, 2 volumes of The Strong Power Man, or Strong Power Man is the title. There's no "the," I guess. And in fact, when you and I were going back and forth via email last week, we checked out Hell to Breakfast and saw that The Mouth was no longer available.
Yeah, it's
kind of funny.
Well, you know what Brendan did is he's been working on these webcomics for several years now and has a lot of them out there. But he just literally last week overhauled his entire website and hasn't gotten all his webcomics back up yet. Yeah. So we actually had to go back to him and say, hey, we were just looking at this. We're going to talk about it. Where is it?
Yeah, and in fact, when I emailed him and he responded, he said, and I can't remember exactly what he wrote back, but it was something to the effect of, he took it down. He is changing the website, but I got the impression that he may not even have been intending to put Hell to Breakfast or The Mouth back up, because he said, it had been out for a while and people just weren't referring to it or talking about it anymore. And of course, he took it down right around the time that we decided to talk about it for the August webcomics show. So I thought that was fun. So he immediately put it back up and said, oh, I'm really sorry. This is the location, and I'll make sure that it's up. So you can find it if you go to the helltobreakfast.net website and you click on comics. It's going to be the first comic that, at least right now, you're going to find up there. So now this is an already completed comic, but this is the shortest of the 3 webcomics that we're discussing this month.
Yeah, I think this one's only, maybe 30, 40 pages or something like that total.
Yeah. This one I would call, if others are ongoing novels, this is a short story.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's already completed.
Yeah.
So now this is quite a different kind of narrative. How would you describe The Mouth?
That's a good question. One of the things that intrigued me about it is that honestly there is a very definite sequence, right? It's a very sequential narrative in a kind of a traditional sense, but the storyline is not maybe what you would consider a traditional storyline. It's almost more a illustrated commentary on the nature of I don't know, the nature of learning and doing and living life in general. It's almost kind of this Eastern philosophy turned into a modern contemporary comic setting.
That's a good way of putting it. Yes, the Eastern philosophy turned into comic. I like the way you said that. Earlier I had mentioned when we were discussing Plox that I really appreciated Hamaker's sophisticated storytelling because philosophically there's a lot embedded in that narrative. But I think that in a more overt way, Albetski's The Mouth is even more philosophical because, there are some deep issues that are going on here. One was what you had pointed out. It has something to do with Zen philosophy, that it's the process, not the end point, that is what life is all about, or at least what life should be about. And in going through and reading and rereading this short story or short comic, there are several passages that I just kept wanting to point out, and I even wrote down and quoted some. And there's one point, not quite halfway through. I think we're still in the first part, because this is divided into 3 sections. The first section is basically, we got 3 characters: Roos, whose name is Roosevelt, a woman, another woman named Wynn, and then a male called Pierce. And it's not until you get into maybe even the last half that you discover, at least the way I'm reading it, that these 3 characters are siblings. Now, they seem to be adopted siblings because they look strikingly different, but they're siblings nonetheless. That at one point, before the story begins, they'd lost their mother. That becomes important in the last half of the story. But in the first section of the 3, you have the 3 characters who, 2 of them, Roos and Pierce, are following Wynn. Wynn wants to show them something strange. And it's so strange in a way that she doesn't want to tell them why it's strange, because then it'll be even weirder. Okay? So what they eventually go to, and what Wynn shows them, is what's in the title: a mouth. And it is a mouth that is inside of this very large tree. That sounds weird, but that's what happens. And so
it is weird.
And then once they see it is weird. And then once they find the mouth, then we get the second part. And then it's what happens as they're inside of the tree, and when showing them the mouth, and there's dialogue back and forth. And I won't say what happens at the end of section 2, but then we get into section 3. There is an abrupt time shift to where we go into some kind of future point. And we know that because a couple of the characters look significantly older, and they're making comments on what they had experienced earlier in life. And so that's the way the 3 parts of this story are structured. But in that first part, at one point, they're venturing into the woods, and they're not sure, Roos and Pierce, what's going on and what Wynn is trying to show them. And, Roos seems to be this kind of a curmudgeon-y figure. She just woke up. She needs her coffee, actually multiple cups of coffee, in order to, actually become halfway civil. And at one point, Pierce says to her, what more is there to life than going deeper? Because, Pierce is saying that, they should go ahead and follow Wynn, because they can go into the forest and see what's going on, right? It's not just the surface of things. There's something lying underneath. And he says, what more is there to life than going deeper? The surface is nothing but the pretty face. And there's always a ton underneath, whether it's a good-looking book or a creepy forest.
And, that's actually the kind of the theme, I think, that Pierce holds together throughout the whole piece, right? Is Roos has her own idea on how things should work, right? And it's a little fuzzy at times, right? And that might be because she just hasn't had coffee yet. But she's kind of going along, but not really sure about a lot of herself. But Pierce, throughout the entire piece, is very much on the standpoint of, this is about going forward. This is about making progress. This is about taking a journey and figuring out where I am now and where I can be, where I might be, tomorrow, next week, a year from now, or whatever. And he says that, he kind of repeats that theme throughout the entire book, or throughout the entire story. And it's an interesting counterpoint to then the character of Wynn, who's very much more of the moment, right? She's and very much focused on the moment of that the completion, right? She's taking him on this journey, this adventure to the mouth, right? And she's the entire time talking about, we have to get to the mouth. We need to go to that mouth. I need to show you this thing in the forest, and we have to go to the forest, right? She's focused on that destination, whereas Pierce is saying, hey, this could be interesting. Let's follow, because we don't know what's going to happen along the way.
Yeah.
And that kind of gets to that, the kind of the focus of the whole piece is, what makes more sense, right? Is it more about the journey? Is it more about the destination? Yeah. Where's the importance lie, and why is that important?
Now, speaking of making sense, I want to make sure that I'm understanding what's going on with the mouth, and I don't want to give away any spoilers, so I'm not going to say what ultimately happens in that second section when they're inside the tree at the mouth. But Wynn points out that she learned about the mouth when she was wandering off on her own and came across this figure, this man, and kind of a mysterious guy. And he showed her the mouth, and he kind of taught her what the mouth was all about. And what she learned was that if you put something or throw something into the mouth, it immediately becomes a part of you. So, for instance, in one case, Ruse, who has her cup of coffee, she drinks coffee all the time. She uses it only to wake up, but it's kind of comforting, right? The way that many of us drink that. So at one point, she throws her coffee cup, which has coffee in it, into the mouth. And correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I didn't understand it correctly, but Roos, the coffee becomes a part of her to where she doesn't need it anymore.
Right.
And at first she kind of liked that, but then she realized, I'm not going to want to drink coffee anymore, and I'm going to miss that. And that's what Wynn points out, that once you throw or put something into this large mouth, and I know it sounds weird, a mouth inside of a tree, but once you put something inside of it, it becomes a part of you. You don't need the process of getting to whatever that thing is anymore, or trying to acquire it, or trying to understand it. And so that gets back to the character of Pierce, who, as you point out, throughout this short story, mentioned several times, it's not the point of arrival. It's not the destination. It is the journey on the way there. It's the process. Because at one point, I think if I remember correctly, Wynn asks him to put his book that he's reading, because he's a really big book reader, throw the book into the mouth. And he says, I don't want to do that, because if I do that, then the book will become a part of me. I'll know it. I won't forget any parts and won't be impelled to go back and reread it. And I like to go back and reread and remind myself of what I've read.
Yeah, and that was one of the bits that stood out for me is, Wynn is explaining this whole process to Pierce, and she says, if you put the book in, it's not like you just read it. It's like you would read it 1,000 times. Right? You've just absorbed every part of that. And so there's nothing else you can learn out of that, right? If you read, because, you and I both, just in reading this, you said, you had to read that a couple of times and you got a little bit something different out of it each time, right? That happens with everything. You read a book, you watch a movie, you have some sort of experience. The next time you go through that, you're going to get a slightly different experience. Even if you think all of the variables are identical in every other aspect, your impression of it is going to be a little bit different for some reason or another, right?
Exactly.
And that's what she's saying is, not only have you read that book, if you throw that book in the mouth, you will have read every possible version of that book. You will have experienced that book in every possible way you could possibly imagine.
Right. Now, anybody about to take a major exam, I think they would not balk at all in throwing their book into that mouth.
Well, we should point out these are not students that we're talking about here. These are adults. I think students might have a different outlook.
Yeah, exactly. But so Pierce is, I guess, the primary philosophical voice, but it's not just him that's the philosophical one. I think it's the dialogue among these three characters.
Right.
And even though we've been talking a lot about Pierce and Wynn, really the main character of this story is Roosevelt, or Roos. Not only is she the one that we see at the very beginning and at the very end, but she's also the narrator, because we get her, I guess you could call it a voiceover, or she becomes what Thierry Grunstein calls a reciter. And she is narrating in almost voiceover manner. If this were a film, it'd be a voiceover. Something that has happened to her in the past. And so from the very beginning, she's already lived these experiences. But the visual story that we get, what we see in the comic itself, is what has happened in the past. As she's narrating it, she's already lived those experiences. And we don't get a sense of that as much until you get to the end of the story and you realize, oh, she's much older now. She's learned a lot more things. And so she's going back. So she's the one who, this is, I guess, in many ways her story. You know, we were talking earlier about Bird Boy being a coming of age and a growth narrative. In a different way, The Mouth is a growth narrative when it comes to the character of Ruse, because she definitely seems to learn some things, some heavy shit along the way.
Yeah, and it kind of has to be that, because we really only have the three characters. All right, there's no background characters at all in this, right? So we have Pierce, who's got very much the one end of the philosophical spectrum, and Wynn at the very other end of the philosophical spectrum, which so both of those characters act not so much as characters so much as the ideas themselves, right? Their physical representation of those philosophies that they're espousing. And I don't think, most people really live to that, right? You and I and everybody listening right now, we're somewhere in the middle, right? Maybe a little leaning one way or a little leaning another way, but there's, we're in some kind of gray area in the middle. And I think that's why Ruse stands out as the main character. She's the conduit for the reader to kind of discuss and debate these different ideas and these different philosophies.
Exactly. And to get a little Hegelian here, which I never do on the podcast, by the way. I mean, if Pierce is the thesis and Wynn is the antithesis, or vice versa, then we have Ruse is the synthesis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So, even though this was the shortest of the three comics, it definitely is the most philosophically impactful.
Oh yeah. Well, like I said, he doesn't have the point of it isn't quite the same as the other ones, right?
Exactly.
He's definitely looking to tell he's using the comic narrative to develop a point, and not so much just to tell a story.
Yeah, and and in many ways, that's why this comic, The Mouth, reminds me of at least a prose equivalent of something that you would find written by Nathaniel Hawthorne or Edgar Allan Poe.
I'd have gone with
Lovecraft?
No. Jonathan Swift.
Jonathan Swift.
Same idea, though.
Really? Okay. I don't know. It's the weirdness of The Mouth that maybe I should have said Lovecraft to begin with.
Well, yeah, I would go with Lovecraft from the weirdness aspect of it and the kind of surrealness, absolutely. But I'm thinking more in terms of the point, the kind of the idea behind the writing in the first place. Yeah. I would go with more with Swift.
You were thinking about A Modest Proposal, were you, just because of that mouth?
Honestly, that was the first work I thought of, but that's only because that's the first work of his I read.
Okay. By the way, if our listeners are not familiar with A Modest Proposal, go look it up and make sure that you haven't eaten anything right before doing so.
And don't worry, that was a short one too. So
yeah, it was.
That's a quick read.
Yeah. Now, another thing that makes The Mouth a quick read is it is laid out very differently from most other webcomics, and not just the ones that we've discussed this month. Everything is on one page. You just scroll down. And so as you scroll, you'll find the various pages or installments as they were published. And speaking of as they were published, I couldn't tell when these were originally put out, over what time span. If you click on each individual image, it will take you to that image's page on its own. And the dates here basically span between August 15th of last year and September 15th of last year, but I'm wondering if that's the dates that he last uploaded those images to whatever site it's on now. Because it's not, I wouldn't think that he would have created all of this over a month's period, because many of these pages went up apparently on the same day. So I don't know how long it took to do this, although it probably all took place in 2014, because with not all, but almost all of the pages, there is a date. There's his name and date right underneath. And they all say 2014.
I don't know how he developed it and how long it took him to actually put it together, but I think actually the dates do represent when they went live on the site originally. So
he could have had quite a number of pages ready and then threw a number of them up at one time. Yeah,
I've been following Brendan's site for a little while now, and I do remember this when it first went up, and he's very he's not very consistent in terms of every Thursday there's a new page up or anything like that. He has more of a sporadic schedule on putting things up, and it kind of goes back to his approach in general. Is he's got several of these small, relatively short comics that are take you maybe a month to go through, or 2 months, or something like that, or sometimes even he's got little one-offs that take a day. And he's kind of just flows with whatever he feels that the inclination to kind of dive down into. And sometimes that's a little bit more philosophical. Sometimes they're a little more superheroic. The current one he's got has got a little bit more superpowers and trying to talk on the nature of superheroes and superhero comics. There's probably some other deep stuff there that I'm not thinking of off the top. So he's doing a lot of work in putting these together. I don't know that they necessarily go up as he's getting them completed, though.
Okay.
Right? So he this may have been something he had in the bag. It took him 3 months to work on or whatever, and then put it up as he got a break in his schedule and said, "Oh, let me put this up over the course of a month or whatever."
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to check out this other comic up here now, The Continuing Adventures of Strong Power Man, if for no other reason because on the cover of one of the issues or one of the volumes, someone's being kicked in the nuts. So yeah. That's good comics reading right there.
Oh, absolutely.
So, Sean, we started off with Steve Hamaker's Plox. We moved on to Ann Szabla's Bird Boy, and then wrapped up with the more philosophical Brendan Albetski's The Mouth. So I think that was a full episode for this month.
It sure seemed like it to me.
And it was your very first, so congratulations.
I made it through. I think I'm officially a co-host now, I believe, if that qualifies. Unless I have to wait until I get actually formally paid for this or not.
Yeah, actually, no. What we're going to do is on the website.
Not sure how that works.
We're going to set up a comment section, so like people can do with webcomics, our listeners can put up comments. Throw the bum out or keep him on. So I'll wait till that comes in. The jury.
I'm going to revert back to my old internet Adam. Is you don't read the comments ever. Yes. Just never read the comments.
Nope, you're definitely on board, and we will have your bio and personal info up on the website as soon as you send it. So welcome to the Comics Alternative, the Webcomics monthly series, and I look forward to reading many webcomics with you in the months to come, my friend.
Well, thank you. It's been a fun, great episode, and I'm looking forward to doing a lot more.
Yes. And if you enjoyed this episode, how can you say thank you? Well, you can do it easily by going to the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. They have some great deals there. And if you're into digital comics, and as we all know, every webcomic is digital, but not every digital is a webcomic. But if you like digital comics, then go to their sister company, and that is mydigitalcomics.com. So whether you like your comics in hard copy or in digital format, you can't go wrong with those guys. And then after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things that you're reading. If you go to our webpage, comicsalternative.com, you'll find on the right-hand side of your browser a Send Voicemail tab. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use. Or if you want to, you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can email the podcast. We're two guys at comicsalternative.com. You can email me directly at Derek at comicsalternative.com. In the next couple of days, you can contact Sean directly at Sean at comicsalternative.com. You can also go to our Twitter account. We're at the number 2 guys with PhDs. And thank you everyone who continues to retweet our tweets. You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google Plus, and on Pinterest. Hey, we even have a YouTube channel. So if you like to consume your media that way, you can listen to the podcast through YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And of course, you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at comicsalternative.com. So, Sean, there's a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us. And, you know, one of the things we ought to do is we ought to ask our listeners to contribute on the forum. Andy Wolverton and I used to do this, as every now and again we'd ask people to chime in on the forum about some of the webcomics they're reading. And, you know, we've found several that we have discussed on the show. So I know that, you know, Sean, you're very web smart or web comic knowledgeable, but maybe some of our listeners can stump you with one you haven't heard of before.
Oh, I can guarantee that. I keep up with as many as I can, but there are thousands and thousands out there. There's just no way I can even know about all of them. So, yeah, absolutely. I'm open to seeing whatever everybody else is reading.
Yeah. Well, let's hear from you guys who are listening. So we appreciate that. Until next month, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean.
We'll see you then.